This is going to be another video in my continuing series where I compare the Beatles catalog, the stereo and the mono releases. Today I am going to be talking about Beatles For Sale. Now this was released on December 4th in 1964. It was the last album that the Beatles released before the Christmas season and the end of a very busy and productive year for them, a year that saw them break in America. They released, in the UK at least, the EP Long Tall Sally. You had the A Hard Day's Night album and film, and you had several singles sprinkled in there also as well. And then to close out the year, there were the singles I Feel Fine, She's a Woman, and then the accompanying album Beatles For Sale. This is the stereo copy that I have. And it's kind of an interesting layout. The album is actually tucked in here and does not want to come out very easily. So it takes a little bit of persuasion to get it out. And I'm not sure where this copy dates from. I don't know, what year or anything like that. I really have no information on it. I'm sure I could look it up, but as of this video, I'm not sure what decade or anything like that this comes from. I also have a couple of 180 gram remasters from 2013. This is the stereo version, and the album is not tucked in here. It's just kind of a regular gatefold. The album comes out of this sleeve. It's on the black and yellow Parlophone label, and the cardstock on the actual sleeve itself is thicker. One thing that I did notice too, and I'll try to compare them as best I can side by side, is that the color hue on each of these albums is slightly different. If you look at this one, even compared to, this is the mono version, you can see that it's quite a bit darker, and the color hues and scheme is a bit different. Even when you compare this one to this one, you can see these colors are a little bit more washed out. So quite a bit of variety that you see just in the color scheme, in particular this album. This again is the 180 gram, this is the mono version. And this was very true to the original sleeve as it was released in the UK. And this one, the album is tucked into here, so you can pull this out of here. I won't pull it out. It's the black and yellow Parlophone label. And so, other than the way the colors look, everything is pretty much the same. Now, cassettes, this is the cassette version that I have. And the track listing starts off on side 1 with No Reply, then Babies in Black, 8 Days a Week, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, I'll Follow the Sun, What You're Doing, Honey Don't, and then I'm a Loser. And then on side 2, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, Rock and Roll Music, Mr. Moonlight, Words of Love, and then Kansas City with the Hey 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 medley and Every Little Thing. So the track listing is quite a bit out of sequence there. This is the 1987 CD release. And out of all the 1987 CDs, I find this to be the most faithful in terms of the packaging. It really closely replicates the information that was inside the actual gatefold. They preserve the back cover, the liner notes are there, so really one of the last times that they did an excellent job with the 1987 CD packaging. And then in 2009, they came out with the stereo. This was released in mono, And so this was the first stereo release on CD when they did the 2009 remasters. And the packaging is more elaborate. Opens up into this trifold, gatefold with another photograph from the Robert Whittaker album sessions that yielded the cover photograph. And like with all the 2009 releases, you get extra photographs. There's some essays about the making of the album. This also contains, if you put it into your computer, it'll play a video about the Beatles For Sale album. So you get quite a lot for your money. And this was a real, significant packaging improvement. Not that there was necessarily anything wrong with the original, but you just get more information, and it's definitely, more for your value, I would say. And then lastly, this is the mono version, which was released as part of the mono box set. You can't buy this individually. You have to get it as part of the mono box set. And again, when I'm talking in terms of the differences in the color for these albums, this one's a bit brighter. This one has a little more darker tone to it, even the back cover. And this, again, with all the mono releases, they are faithful reproductions of the actual sleeve. It's got Beatles For Sale on the spine there. And the CD itself is also on the black and yellow Parlophone label. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into track by track for the Beatles For Sale album. And for each track, this is the first video, I'm going to separate each track, stereo and mono, by instrument. So I'm going to be looking at the vocals, taking a look at the bass, the guitars, the drum, percussion, keyboards, and then finally rendering a verdict about, to my ears anyway, which version I prefer. So the album starts off with No Reply, and in terms of any differences between the two mixes, in the first two lines of the second verse in the mono version, there is double tracking. The second verse backing vocals are present on the word place only. So when he says, in my place, there's only double tracking on the word place. In stereo, the first two lines of the second verse are single tracked, and the second verse backing vocals are present on the entire lyric, in my place. So on all three words. I don't know if you can follow me on all of that, but basically there's some differences in single tracking and double tracking in the song No Reply. The vocals I found were clear in both versions. They were a little bit clearer on stereo, so I'm going to give the nod there. And the bass and the mono was somewhat muted. Could not hear it as clearly. It was a little harder to focus on. And I noticed in stereo, the bass seems to be entirely in the right channel. Although the bass was louder, even in stereo, even in the right channel. So I'm going to give the nod to stereo again on that one. The guitars, in mono, the acoustic guitar is very clear. It's also pretty clear in stereo, just a little bit clearer I found. So again, stereo is my preferred way of hearing the guitars. The drums and percussion was much clearer in stereo, especially the tapping and the verses I found was a lot clearer in stereo. And so the keyboards is the last element that I'm going to look at, and I noticed that they were most audible. The piano was most audible in the chorus. Couldn't really hear it too well in the verses themselves, but when you got that like crashing, those crashing chords in the chorus, you could definitely hear it clear in mono. I found in stereo it was a bit clearer all the way through. So overall, the track No Reply I felt was suited better in stereo. So now we're going to get to the track I'm a Loser. There are no differences between the two mixes. It's essentially the same take, same mixes, no differences and double tracking or anything like that. In vocals, the mono, it was very clear. However, I found that in the stereo, the vocals are really pushed out in front and they're also very clear. So I prefer the stereo version. The bass is clear in mono, but it's very clear and it's much louder in stereo. The guitars are clear in the verses in mono. That's where I found you could really hear and appreciate the guitars in the mono version. However, they really sparkle in stereo. Stereo, I found they're bright, they sparkle, just a much more enjoyable listening experience. The drums and percussion in the mono version were very weak except for the chorus. The tambourine is clear throughout, but the rest of the drumming I found is a little difficult to focus in on. The drums in the stereo version were very clear throughout, had no issue hearing them, and they carry throughout the song. So I'm going to go with the stereo version on the track I'm a Loser, and I'm going to interject right here. Now in 1987, for the longest time until they did the 2009 reissue, the only version, or the version that most people listening to CD got used to, was the version on stereo. Now the only version that you're able to find on Spotify and some of the other streaming services is the stereo version. So I found the mono is a little bit rarer to get a hold of. Not to say there's nothing wrong with the mono mixes, and even though I'm obviously giving preference to the stereo versions here, keep in mind the mono version for a while was the only version that we had access to on CD at least. The third track is Babies in Black. No differences in either mix. The harmony is not as clear in mono, I found. Paul's harmony vocal is much louder in stereo, and it's much easier to hear in stereo. The mono bass is very weak compared to the stereo version, and the stereo version, it just jumps out of the speakers. It's really very loud and very clear. The guitars are clear in mono, but they're clearer and louder in stereo. The drums I felt were weak compared to stereo. Again, the drumming is just hard to focus in on. It's hard to hear in spots. It's much clearer in stereo. So Ringo is served much better by stereo. There are no keyboards in this song, so we're not gonna, hone in on that. At least no keyboards of any note, nothing that you would focus in on. So the verdict on Babies in Black, and now we're 3 tracks in, and every track has been a favorite in stereo. Babies in Black, again, in stereo. Rock and roll music, no differences in the mixes or the takes. In stereo, the vocal was very clear and out, in mono rock and roll music, the vocal is very clear and out in front, whereas in the stereo version, it's a little buried in the mix. It's a little harder to hear. I would say hard to hear, but just in terms of appreciating the vocal, having it stand out. In mono, it stands out a lot better. So as far as vocals go, I'm going to give the nod to mono. The bass in mono is very weak compared to stereo. And the stereo version, it's mixed very well. It's loud, it's prominent, no trouble hearing it at all. The guitars are also weak compared to the stereo version. In stereo, it's clearer, you can hear the strumming, just a lot easier to appreciate the guitars in the stereo version. In the mono version, the drums and the percussion blend well in. They blend in well with the rest of the track, but in stereo, they're just much clearer. The drums, again, you can appreciate much better in stereo. The keyboards are actually clearer in mono, I found out. In stereo, they're not very clear except for the occasional flourish and in the last chorus where they kind of pick up the tempo and the intensity of the playing picks up. But otherwise, I'm going to go with mono. I feel like the keyboards were much better served in mono on that mix. Weighing all those things, again, I'm going to go with stereo for the 4th track, rock and roll music. So the 5th track is I'll Follow the Sun. It's a little quieter track. It's a track that actually dates back to the early 60s. It's one of the first songs that Paul actually wrote, so it's interesting that they resurrected it for this album. No differences in the mixes. The vocals are very clear in mono, particularly the harmonies. There's way too much echo in stereo, I found, so I prefer the mono version for the harmonies. The bass, however, is somewhat muted in mono, and it's much louder in stereo than it is in mono. The acoustic guitar is clear in mono, but you can actually hear both the acoustic and rhythm guitar very nicely in stereo. The drums and percussion is very clear in the mono version, but I found that it was a little too loud. I don't think it served the song that well in stereo. Just the volume of the drums, the way they were mixed, I felt was a little too loud, a little too heavy-handed. So there's no keyboards in that track, and so we're left with the verdict, and I'm going to say I'll Follow the Sun sounds better in mono. The mono mix is better. Mr. Moonlight, probably the most polarizing track on this whole album. Many Beatle fans consider this one of their least favorite Beatle tracks, but going to quickly review it anyway. No differences in the mixes. The vocals were very out front in the mix on the mono version, whereas there's a lot of echo in stereo, so I prefer the mono vocals. The bass is muted in mono, and it's somewhat muted in stereo, but it's still easier to hear, so I'm going to go with stereo on that. The guitars are clear in mono, but they're much clearer in stereo. Same for the drums and percussion. While they're clear in mono, they're just much louder and clearer in stereo. So I'm going to go with a stereo track in terms of the two of these. Stereo just sounds much livelier and brighter, and it's more enjoyable. If you had to listen to either of the mixes, a stereo would be the one to go with, in my opinion. The last track on side one is the medley Kansas City and Hey 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 Hey. There are no differences in the mixes. The vocals are much clearer in mono. In stereo, they're buried in the mix, and they're almost overwhelmed by the bass and the guitars. So I'm going to go with mono for the vocals. The bass is muted in mono. It's much louder and clearer in stereo. The guitars, there's not as much separation from the bass in the mono mix. So I found in stereo, the guitars were very clear and very bright. The drums and percussion were weaker in mono. Not that they were bad, but I found that they were much clearer in stereo. And also the keyboards were a little clearer in stereo. So I'm going to go with the stereo mix for Kansas City. So flipping the album over, if you're listening on vinyl, first track is 8 Days a Week. No differences in the mixes. The vocals were clear in both. I'm going to give that a tie. I didn't feel like the vocals were better in stereo or better in mono. I felt like they were pretty comparable. Now for the bass guitar, I found the bass was somewhat buried in the mix in mono, but it was much louder and fuller in stereo. However, the guitars, the acoustic guitar was much more noticeable in mono, whereas I feel in stereo the acoustic guitar was overwhelmed by the bass and a little harder to focus in on and a little harder to hear. It did not stand out. The drums and percussion were clear in both mixes. I'm going to give that a tie. Couldn't really determine that they were better in mono or better in stereo, so that one's a draw. No keyboards in that track, and so ultimately the verdict at the end of listening to it, I felt I enjoyed stereo a bit more. The track Words of Love, there are no differences in the mixes. The vocals are much clearer in mono, particularly the harmonies, so it's much enjoyable, and I feel that's really a track that benefits from those harmonies. The vocals are somewhat buried in the mix. They're kind of overwhelmed by the rest of the backing track in stereo. The bass is mixed very low in mono, whereas it's very clear in stereo, so prefer the stereo for the bass. The guitars are not as loud or as full in mono. In fact, they kind of sound a little tinny. So I'm going to go with the stereo because they're louder, they're brighter, they're clearer, there's separation there, they're much easier to enjoy. In the percussion and drums, in mono the hand clapping is clear, but the drums are muted. In stereo, I found that the percussion and the drums are clear and easy to focus in on. No keyboards in that track, and so I am gonna go ultimately with stereo unless you want to listen to the vocals. Vocals definitely sound better in mono, but everything else I found is much better in stereo. So we're on to track 3, Ringo's song Honey Don't, which is a Carl Perkins cover. No differences in the mixes. The vocals in mono are very out in front of the mix, so it's very easy to hear Ringo's vocal. You can very much tune in on it and appreciate it. They're slightly buried in the mix on stereo, so for the vocals, I prefer the mono. The bass is a little muted in the mono version, however, it's much fuller and much more prominent in the stereo mix. The acoustic guitars are clear throughout the track in mono, however, the electric guitars are a little brighter in stereo. The acoustic guitars are slightly drowned out by the bass in the stereo version, except for the chorus. So I'm going to call that again a draw. I didn't find that there was a substantial difference in either one, or at least not a difference that made one version or either the stereo or the mono more enjoyable. In Honey Don't, the tambourine is clear, but the rest of the drums are muted, whereas in the stereo version, the drums are much clearer. There's no keyboards in that song either. So, believe it or not, I actually prefer the mono version of Honey Don't. It's a very nice mix. Ringo's voice really carries the song. So, that was the version that I enjoyed between the two. Really a good mono mix. Every Little Thing, there's no differences in the mixes. The vocals are very clear in both versions, so I'm not going to give a nod either way. I felt they're both comparable. The bass guitar is buried in the mix in mono, whereas it's much clearer in stereo. The acoustic guitar is clear. However, the rhythm guitar, not so much in mono. In stereo version, both the acoustic guitar and the rhythm guitar are clear. The drums are clear in spots in mono, but then they kind of drop out, whereas I felt in stereo, they're clear all the way through the whole song. The keyboards are slightly muted in mono, except for the chorus, where there's more, obviously, there's stronger playing, and so they stand out a little bit more. Whereas I felt pretty much the whole way through they were clear in stereo. So I am going to give the nod to stereo version of Every Little Thing. Moving on to the end of the album, we're getting into the last three tracks. I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. Now, there is a slight difference between the two mixes where in stereo, right before the instrumental breaks, there's two whoop whoops. You have to listen clear for them. You have to really listen for them, but they're there, whereas they're entirely missing from the mono version. That's right before the instrumental break. Other than that, there's no differences between the two mixes. I found the vocals were clear in mono. They were clear in stereo, but there's really an emphasis on the vocals on the mono version. The bass was weaker in mono, whereas it's very clear in stereo. The guitars are buried slightly in the mix. The lead guitar sounds really nice, but the rest of the guitar, they're kind of, pushed to the back, whereas they're much punchier and just more forceful and brighter in stereo. The drums were mixed lower, I found, throughout the Tonight She's Made Me Sad section. I don't know if we call that the chorus, or I don't know song structure well enough to be able to tell you what we would call that, but the Tonight She's Made Me Sad section, I felt the drums were mixed lower, but otherwise clear in mono, and I felt they were clear throughout in stereo. However, I did prefer the mono version of that track. It just felt more organic. It felt like there was less kind of production interference on it. The instrumentals didn't overwhelm the vocals, so got to give the nod to mono for I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. What You're Doing, no differences in the mixes. The vocals are very clear in mono, whereas there's a lot of echo in stereo. Didn't enjoy Paul's vocal as much in stereo, so I'm going to go with the mono version on that. The bass is somewhat muted in mono, but it's much clearer in stereo. The acoustic guitar is very low in the mix in the mono version, but in stereo, the acoustic guitar is clear and the electric guitars are much brighter. They sparkle a lot more. The drums and percussion were clear on both versions. I'm not going to say one was better than the other. And the keyboards were mixed low in the mono version, but I feel they're slightly more audible in stereo. So the version I'm going to go with for What You're Doing, even though the vocal I felt was better in mono, and every other way I preferred the stereo version. Last track on the album, George's Guitar Showcase, another Carl Perkins cover, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. No differences in the mixes. Lots of echo on both the vocals, so that's kind of a draw. I was expecting to hear a clearer vocal in mono than in stereo, where you kind of expect more echo and reverb, but I didn't find that to be the case, so that's going to be a draw. The bass was clear in both tracks, couldn't really decide one way or the other. I feel that was a draw. In mono, the guitar doesn't have the same fullness or sparkle as it does in stereo, and the acoustic guitars are mixed very low. In stereo, the guitar really chimes and it almost pings. That's how loud and how out front it is. So I'm going to give the nod to stereo for the guitars. The drums and percussion, in mono they were clearer during the guitar solos, but otherwise they were somewhat muted. Whereas in stereo, I felt that the drums and percussion were clear all the way through, no trouble hearing them. No keyboards in that track, so finally my verdict is going to be stereo for Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. And so it won't come as any surprise that my final verdict between the mono version or the stereo version of Beatles For Sale, gonna go with the stereo version. Just enjoyed it a bit more. If I had to put it on right now and listen to it all the way through, which version I would choose would definitely be stereo. Interested to hear your comments if you compare them both and what you thought, any interesting differences you noticed in the mixes. Again, this video is run a little bit long, but I appreciate you tuning in. And the next one I will probably do will be the American Beatles 65 and Beatles 6 albums. Thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, and thanks for the likes, and take care.